Morning. You know, as I start to settle into my middle age, turn 42 this year, it starts to become really obvious how much different the world is now than the one I grew up in. And to be fair, I was born in 1980. I grew up through the 80s, I grew up through the 90s, I grew up through the rise of video games and the internet, the fall of the Berlin Wall, the AIDS epidemic. My generation saw a faster advance of technology than any generation before or after in our lifetime and childhood. We are unique in that we got to see the old world, the way the world used to run when we were little, and we got to see the world evolve into something different. We're the generation that got to live in both worlds. We're kind of the bridge between one to another. We have lived in both worlds, and the fact that some of us are entering our middle age now, I'm turning 42, it is almost half a century, well, we're starting to notice just how different things are than when we started out. When I think back on it, it seems like just yesterday, but honestly, 42 years is a long fucking time. A lot of shit has changed. The world just is not the same world I grew up in. Like a really good example of that is stuff like racism. I mean, racism was really straightforward when I was growing up in the 80s. It was bad and it was about race. And then a bunch of people started conflating the concept with racism with classism. What was once really simple and straightforward suddenly became really complicated and full of nuance and requiring context. They started to tie all these economic concerns into the concept, like basically if you are economically well off or you have certain economic advantages, you're somehow less susceptible to racism. No, you are describing classism. You're talking about advantages based on your economic station in the world. The fact that there is a larger proportion of Caucasian people doing economically well in particular countries doesn't mean that they're less susceptible to racism. It means that they're doing better economically in that country. Am I saying that racism is absent from that scenario? No, probably not. There's probably a reason that there's a higher proportion of a particular race doing better economically in an area, and that should probably be looked into. I'm not dismissing concepts like institutional racism, but that doesn't mean that the people who are doing better economically are therefore less susceptible to racism. That's not what you're describing. If a minority individual in one of these countries is lucky enough or works hard enough to achieve great success financially and socially, does that mean the people he interacts with have suddenly stopped being racist toward him? No. He's receiving special consideration because of his economic station. They didn't suddenly stop seeing the color of his skin. They just see all the dollar signs, and that makes them treat him differently. To his face, anyway. Human beings are a very complicated animal. These ideas are generally applied to Western countries where predominantly the wealthy are white, but I have a feeling that if you applied it to countries where that isn't the case, say Hong Kong, I'm pretty sure that you could still be racist toward Asian people in Hong Kong. Racism is about race. You can tell on account of it being in the word. There's a lot of people that have conflated racism and classism and tried to tie a bunch of economic concerns into it and basically coming to the conclusion that if you have certain economic advantages, you are somehow less susceptible to experiencing racism. You're misusing the word. Racism is about your race. Classism is about your class and your economic station. When people started confusing those two concepts, I think we started down a slippery slope. We slipped all the way down to statements like, you can't be racist toward white people. Why not? Because of economic advantages? Not all white people are rich. You're painting an entire race with the same brush. You have a set of preconceived ideas about a particular race or ethnicity, and you're applying to them as a blanket assessment. That's what racism is. When you hear a statement like you can't be racist toward white people, you should recognize that for what it is. And what it is someone trying to give themselves permission to be awful. Redefining words to make a point or explain something is a manipulation tactic, and it generally means the person doing it is full of shit. If racism is all about race, but you somehow can't be racist toward white people, does that mean that white people aren't a race? And if white people aren't a race and you can't be racist to them, does that also mean that since they're not a race, they can't be racist toward you? And then you get into stuff like CRT, critical race theory, where basically the idea is all you ever are, all you're ever going to be, all you're ever capable of being is decided by the color of your skin. That sounds like racism. Like, isn't that exactly what racism is? Applying a bunch of preconceived ideas about a race to an entire group? Just a blanket assessment of people based on preconceived ideas about people that share that color of skin? Isn't that just racism? To my mind, CRT is just the hip new way for racists to feel intellectual about their hate, and it is incredibly reductive on an individual basis. Reducing an individual to the color of their skin, deciding that all they can do or achieve in their life is based on their race, deciding whether someone gets heard or the value of their opinion based on their skin, that's not progress. You're backsliding into bullshit. I think that initially, political correctness and identity politics, the motives there were probably altruistic. They were probably honestly trying to make the world a better place. But unfortunately, when these concepts entered the arena of politics, they became weaponized as ways to manipulate citizens in particular ways and in particular directions. The original idea behind it all has been twisted, perverted, and inverted to be basically the exact opposite of what it started out as.
It has been said that the path to hell is paved with good intentions.
When political correctness began to interact with politics, they started to weaponize it to assign value to certain opinions. They would increase the volume on some voices while decreasing the value on other voices, and used it all to manipulate and sway public opinion in ways beneficial to whatever narrative they were pushing. This almost religious style of thinking, with its rule book and ideal picture of virtue, it leads to similar results with things like doxing, canceling. Basically, they are banishing you from the village. There is a manipulation tactic called cognitive empathy. It's often employed by politicians, salespeople, people of that nature, and it's a way to manipulate others to get what you want. You virtue signal, you say all the right things, you connect with people on a personal level to get them to do the things you want them to do and to make them feel good about it, to make them feel that if they do what they're told, they're a good person because they're listening to a good person tell them what to do. By and large, most people want to feel like they're doing the right thing, and they definitely want other people to know that they're doing the right thing. But even more than that, they like to feel like they're a little bit better than other people. As this sort of politics started to gain in popularity, as identity started to become a political tool, we started to see that there was a rule book being written. We also started to see that so long as a public figure appeared to follow this rule book to the letter and to let you know they were following it, it started to become a substitute for actual virtue. Assigning yourself a label became a substitute for actually developing a personality or achieving things. Just the label itself became an achievement all its own. As we started to see the ideas of political correctness and identity politics and virtue signaling rise into popularity, I think we've also seen a corresponding slip of individuality. I don't think individuality is really considered as important now. There's been a real swing toward collectivism, groupthink, breaking people down by their gender or race or ethnic identities. There has been a definite shift in the way people relate to each other anymore. Judging a person on their individual merits has very much fallen out of fashion, and it's much more common now to put someone into a box and decide that you know everything you need to know about them. I think that as you start to do that, you start to dehumanize people. Right? You start to disassociate them as individual persons and start to think of them as those labels, as those boxes that you put them in. We are living in an upside down world. Left is right, up is down, good is bad, and feelings are facts.